identity is wrapped up in the experience for people, right? They're not just going for this one moment. The one moment's very important, don't get me wrong, but the lead up to all of this and what they expect and how they want to behave and how they want to consume when they are there has a lot to do with who they are as a human being.
Thank you so much for tuning into Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. I'm your host, Christian D. Evans. This next guest, he brings 20 years of marketing and branding experience to the table in every interaction, leveraging his deep understanding of the human subconscious and the phenomenon he calls fandom. His career began in therapeutic environment, which has informed his human-centric vision of marketing from the outset. The insight has served him well in his role for major brands in the NBA, MLB, NHL, and other sports franchises around the world. Prior to launching his current company, Seer World, Peter has Chief Creative Officer at EVP brand for the Atlantic Hawks and Phillips Arena. At the Hawks, he managed the brand, marketing, digital creative, product content, innovation, and retail teams. And he's also led the repositioning and rebranding of the Hawks franchise and served as a design lead on the $200 million experience-first renovation. And he was able to explode it up to the right trajectory. And we're so excited about having him on. Please welcome my next guest, the one and only Peter Sorckoff. How are you doing today, Peter?
I'm doing great, sir. How are you? Man, that was a mouthful to get through. Kudos to you, and we're just getting started.
Well, hey, I'm really excited about having this conversation because one of the things I want to really kind of start out as the foundation here. On your guys' website, seer.world, you focus on understanding the elephant and the rider. And let me explain. You talk about the quickest way to understand the human mind is to think about an elephant and a rider. The elephant is your subconscious mind, where emotion rules. The rider is your conscious mind, where we appear to be rational and in full control. And I want to ask you this, Peter. At what point during your journey and all the experience you've had, did you start realizing that was the key to how human behaviors and human make decisions?
Well, I would say it started in the very beginning, even sort of pre-sports. I had the good fortune of working early in my career in a therapeutic environment. And, you know, in that space, you're really sort of taught to observe and kind of break things down and look for patterns and understand people in this sort of different way. I will tell you that piece that you just went through, articulated in that way, I really, until about 2012, 2013, had never sort of heard it explained in that way. And full credit to Jonathan Haidt, who is a professor at in New York City, and wrote at that time a book which is amazing if anyone's ever looking for sort of a good book recommendation, called The Righteous Mind. And The Righteous Mind was given to me by a friend who knew I was, you know, sort of trying to find this new approach, trying to kind of build onto this fandom idea. And that's when the elephant rider metaphor was sort of put in front of me the first time. And it immediately made sense, not as something new and I'd never kind of like thought of before. It really just articulated a lot of complexity that I had sort of, you know, come in contact with and sort of grew up with early on professionally into this really concise, really well articulated metaphor that I think is extraordinary in terms of being able to just understand when you're observing people and you know, seeing how they actually consume information and then make decisions.
So what I'm always intrigued with is when you realize that, and then you started having this same approach with, you know, your experience in the franchise world and the sports arena, and there's this user experience, and you're understanding, okay, hey, when you're looking at these individuals, how to scale, right? There's a lot that goes into it at a micro level. And I want to ask you, Peter, because you guys do not things just like testing, you guys do a lot of data and gathering prior to actually pushing out a campaign, marketing, whatever it is, development of a project, whatever it is. So I think it's so strategic. It's very tactical. So help me understand, Peter, how you approach data gathering to ensure you're gathering the right information to ensure that whenever you push out a campaign, a marketing, a deployment of a project, whatever it is very strategic. What does that look like, Peter?
Yeah, so there's a process that we've developed over a number of years, which, by the way, I'll tell you, we continue to develop because I think as we encounter, more information and frankly, other really smart people, we'll sort of take nuggets to make our process more sophisticated. But it really starts, honestly, with something as simple as a lit review, where we're just ingesting all the information that's been there previously and trying to understand at how we arrived at that place and sort of what motivated us to arrive to that place. That's got a lot to do with understanding more the organization than it does the consumer or anything on sort of that end, who the audience we're trying to actually market or potentially be positioned in front of. So there's this little thing that we kind of coin organizational mythology. And I've never encountered an organization that doesn't have this in some form, including all the organizations I've ever been a part of, right? It's just a very human thing where there's these stories we tell ourselves internally as to like why things are the way that they are. And we're always trying to find those first and then query them to find out if they're actually real or just perceived, right? So I think to us, real leadership that we admire is always able to sort of differentiate what is real and what is perceived. And that's not always to say what is perceived as negative, but to build real, strategy that you can tactically go and institute and then try to make, change inside of an organization, which is going to allow you to make change outside of the organization. You just have to know what's real. So we do a lot of interviews. The interviews that we do are very conversational. We don't really use sort of a set tool where we're going through and deploying an instrument per se. And that's because we just need to get people disarmed, where they're just being honest and talking about, what they really think and what they really see, and not feeling like in that moment they're judged as, well, that's a real thing or that's a perceived thing. But what's fascinating is, we build what we call a constituent map around this, and the client actually helps us do that. So we make sure that we get a lot of different vectors inside the organization, and then we do the same thing outside the organization. And it doesn't really take that long when you're doing these interviews and starting to break those transcripts down and look at them to be able to see patterns emerge. And when you see patterns, then you can typically start to see how decision-making is formed. And then you can really start kind of breaking things down from there, right? So again, none of that's about sort of good or bad or who's doing something right or wrong. It's more just what is the reality of how things are getting done in this organization and by who, and then ultimately, if we're able to sort of commission first-party research, there's a methodology that we really like. I would describe it as steeped in cultural anthropology, where we're literally studying long-form conversation. And when you're studying long-form conversation in the digital space, where you're able to go back, in many cases as far back as 3 years, meaning there's a lot of data that you can collect and analyze, and you're using machine learning to go through, and you're essentially building linguistic algorithms to go find conversations and then start breaking them down. At that point, that research is either affirming the patterns we've seen through the interviews on sort of the qualitative side, or they're starting to debunk some of the patterns that we thought we were maybe seeing there, because the volume of that data is usually such that the margin for error in your research is really, really nominal. So, the top of the podcast, you referenced the Hawks, and that was really the first time that we deployed that methodology. And, we were able to look at 1.7 million conversations in a 12-month window on brand, right? I mean, that's a lot of data to look through. But most importantly, what it did is it really affirmed some patterns that we were seeing. Most of them negative, but there were a couple that were really, really positive. And the positive ones inside the organization, we just didn't even think existed. We were completely blind to them. So there was some really positive equity around the brand that we had, for a variety of different reasons, absolutely pushed to outer orbit. And frankly realized we were making a lot of really big organizational decisions on deeply flawed perceptions of the market ourselves and how the market felt about us. So, it's the sort of thoroughness on this part, I think, is really, really important, because when you go back into an organization, this is where the human element comes back in. And as people, for a lot of different reasons, we sometimes don't want to actually look at the reality of those things. So bringing it back in such a demonstrative way where the math becomes just impossible to refute, right? Because it's just so glaring in the volume, allows us to then be more thoughtful and empathetic about how we sort of deliver that as a sort of a move forward strategy, even inside the organization, because individuals get tweaked, like, oh my gosh, I don't want this to come out because this has been happening under my management for 5 years or 10 years, or, so that's when you also have to kind of recognize there's, some change management that has to be brought into this equation. And a lot of times if it comes through the CMO, unfortunately, and I'll say this as a, former CMO, in the C-suite, that can sometimes be easily sort of pushed to the side as kind of like that's a bunch of marketing gobbledygook, right? Like that's what the sales, the chief revenue officer will often say, or the COO or the CFO. If we're too much on the elephant side and not enough on the rider side, just to bring it back to the metaphor, because typically that COO, CFO, and especially if the CEO or the president kind of came up through that side of the business, they're very, very accustomed to responding to this kind of messaging if it comes to them in a very organized, process-driven, rational way, right? Whereas marketers are much, much more inclined, in my estimation, in my experience, to be on the rider side of things, and they're really interested in sort of the emotive, and that causes them, I think, sometimes to lose a lot of traction with the rest of the C-suite.
No, and that makes perfect sense, and I appreciate you kind of emphasizing. I want to loop back around in regards to the data, because I had a friend, and I love what you said, where there you have these presuppositions, these assumptions, or these kind of things that you assume that's going to happen, and from maybe previous experience, from your own biases, from whatever it may be, and I think that's so important. And so I'm curious, Peter, when you and your team were looking at that data, and you could put it toward whatever case study you want, were you getting micro with it, where it was like, okay, hey, we were able to take a test size of 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 individuals, right, that went to the stadium. And out of that, we got micro, how many were men, how many were women, how many were married, how many were not married, how many came to college, how many were, were they white collar, were they blue collar, were they, what age group, what all, where do they live in the city? Were they more suburban? Were they more inner city? I'm curious, how micro did you get? Because then whenever you pushed out a marketing campaign, or pushed out kind of that offer, or really helping scale, or the right kind of environment even within the actual arena, all that is making sure that you're talking to the right individual. So how micro, when you're looking at that data, did you get, and what patterns did you start seeing? If you could, I'd love for you to unpack that a little bit further for us.
Yeah, I think we got pretty granular. I would say we got even extraordinarily granular. My hesitation is only, look, as I'll say classically sort of trained marketer, we of course came with this idea of we need to know household income, gender, ethnicity, age, all these kind of things, just as segmentation cuts, basically, right? To try to bracket people, to sort of try to understand the population and how it behaves. I think I was deeply concerned about that as a still efficient model to answer the kind of questions that we were trying to answer, which was, look, there are some very real things, like in that business, proximity to the stadium is kind of a thing, right? Because, we can get into a lot of the inconvenience or friction that occurs with the level of avidity somebody has to come to overcome all of the different friction points just to come to an event live. So, there was some good data to be able to look at it and say, like, okay, if somebody lived within 8 miles of the arena, they had a higher propensity to come to live events. The problem is when you start to add all the other segmentation cuts on top of that, that sort of falls apart, because it was like, okay, well, if you're male and you live within 8 miles, you have a higher propensity. But then it didn't explain why somebody who had less household income, who was male and lived inside of 8 miles, was coming, but somebody who had more income was not. So I think you have to be able to kind of like take some of those kinds of things with a grain of salt. And this is why all of the moral foundation theory stuff was really, really interesting to me, because I think in a lot of Haidt's work in particular, but there are others other than Jonathan Haidt, and he'd be the first to tell you that he's not the only one who's contributed to that body of work. But in a lot of that, when you start to understand human instinct, it's not that things like gender and ethnicity, that they don't matter, that they have no effect. Of course, they have some. But to maybe sort of simply explain it to you, if we had, a African American who was a Christian, 23 years old, female, college educated, household income of $200,000 a year. She's doing very well for herself. And then, next to her, we stood a white male who's 45, not college educated, married, 3 children, and he happens to be Muslim. Oh, and by the way, he's gay. The assumption is that we can't ever put those two people in the same bucket, starting with the fact that one is male and one is female, typically followed by the fact that one is African American and one is Caucasian, and then one is young, one is old, one is wealthy, one is not, one is college educated, one isn't, one is married, one isn't, one has kids, one doesn't, right? So these are all the things that separate us. And the assumption that is made there is that all those things that separate those two human beings mean that they can't see the world the same way. And what we know is that is in fact totally not true. Right? And I think if you just looked at your own sort of friend group and anyone who's listening to this, there's always somebody that you're friends with who doesn't look like you, is not in the same sort of socioeconomic space that you are, or you have some colleague like that. Yet ironically, you guys have this totally parallel view, or almost like compass, that you use to navigate the world. Right? And people use these little colloquialisms like, oh, we're brothers from another mother, right? Or, all these little things that we say to try to explain the unexplainable, because in a rational environment, it makes no sense that the two of you actually agree on most things and see the world the same way in most instances. Right? You're kind of like not supposed to, because the way you look and everything else about you, that typical marketing segmentation would tell you you're not the same and you shouldn't see the world the same way. So that's where we kind of got into okay, we're going to look at all the granularity of that, because we think that there is some efficacy that we can kind of pull out of that in terms of there's real things like proximity to a stadium, right? But then we didn't want to lean so far in on that's what our entire strategy was steeped on. And this started in sports for us, Christian, because what I witnessed night after night, game after game, year after year, was looking out into stadiums, okay, and seeing 18,500, 22,000. I mean, in football or baseball, you're seeing 40,000, 50,000, and football 70, 80,000. And you look around and you see all these people who do not look the same. And then you start walking around asking questions and you're like, oh my gosh, that person is Jewish and this person is Muslim sitting next to them. And then there's 2 atheists that sit the row in front of them, but they're all season ticket holders. And when you go and sit in a section with them and observe them, on Sunday, because it's NFL Sunday, they all know each other's kids. They know all the stories. They know where they live. They don't do anything else in the rest of their life together other than when they come together around whoever their football team is, right? And that's when we started saying, wait a minute. We have to understand that, because if we can understand how that is occurring, then that could or should be a new dimension for how we start to contemplate building strategy, positioning, and frankly, even product, and totally understanding sort of consumer behavior in this very, very different realm than how we have been, which is kind of this very old school, like put all the men over here and all the women over here and all the rich people here and the not so rich people here, right? And notice in sports, I didn't say rich and poor. There's like the haves and then there's the have mores in sports, right? And so that's where a lot of this really, started to develop, because again, we were observing this on a regular basis, deeply, deeply irrational behavior that was just not explainable through these other models that, and mechanisms and sort of views that, that were more traditional.
I love what you said there, because it's so unorthodox, where normally we do have these little buckets and we like to stay in those buckets, and then we gather the data and then run campaigns at a micro level. But what you're basically saying is there's some stream, there's some pattern, there's something that connects everybody, even though they're all drastically different in their own shapes and sizes, if you will, in the kind of a metaphor. Now, I'm curious a little bit, because what I'm intrigued with is when you gather that data and you were pushing that out, you started realizing, okay, we don't want to be orthodox. We want to be unorthodox in this way. When you were starting to run campaigns or bring in some, try to attract them to make sure that we got more sales and stuff like that. Obviously, there was that team structure. You want to make sure that's rock and rolling. But I'm curious, from the user experience to running campaigns to pushing out and getting feedback loop, how quick were you able to push that out? Hey, let's go and run this real quick. And within 2 weeks, we're able to say, okay, that didn't work or that did work. Because I'd love to understand how your brain works, the stories that when you're seeing data coming in, how do you put it contextually? Because like you just mentioned, it is very contextual, and you got to make sure, okay, you bring this data, you got to bring this, and it tells a story, and then it's got to say, okay, there's an answer in here somewhere. So I'd love for you to tell us, when you were pushing out those campaigns, when you're bringing in more those individuals to try to upsell them or whatever it may be on the back end or user experience, I'd love for you to help us understand exactly that feedback loop and what that story was telling you.
Yeah, so I'll get really sort of pragmatic with you on this, but I'll start by saying before we got into that, what we started to understand was from a campaigning perspective at a high level, there could be common narratives that a lot of people who didn't look the same or frankly even kind of live the same could find themselves in, right? So we were sort of like less about storytelling and more about narratives in our campaigns. Narratives, the difference for me being, look, storytelling, there's a beginning, a middle, and end, right? It's kind of got a bow wrapped around it. There's closure with the story. The narrative is very much iterative, and it is meant to be like, yes, there's a beginning, there's a middle, but it can really sort of change with the market, change with people, change with pop culture. And so that is, I think that's a tough place for brand managers, right? Because most of my experience with folks in that space, who a lot of them I really love, they want things to be very clean. Okay. And so people like to have buckets because we like to collate, because when we're able to collate and put things in boxes and then put them on shelves, and we do this with people, by the way, it's kind of like clinical, it's sterile. And that means it's not messy. And so I think that feels like it scales better, okay, when you get into campaigning. I think that a lot of people in that position also feel a tremendous amount of pressure to sort of like deliver some kind of ROI, or here's my KPIs and see how I met them. Because remember, they're trying to explain this back to their COO, their CFO, if they're trying to get more budget, whatever it is, or to product managers who are going to go out and try to build new products for these audiences. So collating these things is a really, really natural human sort of response and phenomenon. The problem with that is, again, you start to make these really, really big assumptions that aren't actually paid out by behavior, right? So it's like it works for the business, but it doesn't actually work for the consumers, which means ultimately it doesn't work for the business. And I think for us, campaigning was about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. And this idea that like we were going to be changing a lot and we were going to be testing a lot and some stuff was going to hit. And if it hit, we needed to understand like, well, what about it hit? And can we basically go back and make another hit like that again? Or was it some anomaly that we can't reproduce again? And so I think that's really, really important with narratives in particular. Because if you start to see people buy into the narrative and they can find their place in that, then you can really get granular about how you try to move them. You know, like let's assume we've already got awareness and the narrative helps us move into relevance. Okay. And if we know that we are relevant because they've bought into the narrative, hopefully for a variety of different reasons, then moving from relevance to conversion is exponentially easier. And that step between relevance and conversion a lot of times has to do more with what you talked about earlier, which is things like UI, UX. Okay. So I'll give you a really like super pragmatic example. I dealt with this both when I was on the team side and with team clients where, we have campaigns that are, really clearly driving awareness and relevance. And people are coming to a buying portal, and I'm not going to mention who the buying portal is actually owned by, but most people are probably going to understand this quickly. And this weird thing starts to happen. It's a really, really crappy experience trying to find my tickets, buy my tickets, move my cart to the end where I'm about to pay. And then I'm like, wait a minute, it said my bill was $400 and now it's like $526. Like what? Right? Which is really jarring for people because they kind of feel like they got duped. And then they go through and they're like $126 in service fees. Right? And so who do they think is duping them at that point? Do they think it is the UI UX provider of the porthole, or do they think it's actually the brand? Right? Because remember, we went from this really emotive place where I was like really psyched. I bought into a narrative. Do you know what I mean? I'm feeling like basically emotionally either invigorated or I'm in that space. And then I have to move to this kind of like much more rational place because I got to kind of like put in my credit card and go through and do all these steps. And it basically sucks all the air out of the room and then you lose people. Right? So the UI UX component of this is absolutely critical, that if you're using these kind of mechanisms and trying to like move people into this very emotional or emotive environment where, they're kind of operating in this instinctual realm, that the transition, if there has to be a really practical, pragmatic piece like we're talking about right now, you've got to really think how those things dovetail together. Okay. So one of the things we did is we just removed fees. So what we did is we built fees into the ticket price. So it was kind of like, hey, there's no bait and switch. The price is the price. So when I go and get my seats and then I move them into my cart and I pay, it's $526. But it said it was $526 when I put the 4 seats in as well. And little things like that are really, really important because at the end of the day, I think when you're campaigning and you're trying to operate in this like brand heart world, right? Because everyone wants to be a heart brand. No one wants to be a head brand these days. Some people are okay being a hand brand. You know what I mean? Like, great. What do you use to brush your teeth? Crest. Do you really think twice when you run out of toothpaste or you just go buy more Crest? That's a hand brand. Right. But in sports, it's very much a heart brand. And most other brand managers today are trying to operate in that space. And it's difficult because if you're going to be there, you have to be there all the way through. And that can be really difficult when you get into sort of the execution side of it. And then how you reach to people after, like let's say I buy this thing, I fell in love. It's got flaws. Now the warranty comes into play. The warranty is great, but maybe getting my warranty enacted is really problematic. All the love goes out of the room. And then ironically, what ends up happening is that person who was in a very emotive space with you is still in an emotive space, but now it's on the other side of the coin. They're in an emotive space telling all their friends how crappy this was. And then they go to all their social channels And while, maybe they only have reach of a couple thousand people with the reach of a couple thousand, right? Geometrically progressing can be a real problem for that brand. So again, I think this is a tough place to operate because it requires somebody, not just kind of really paying attention, but you have to keep paying attention. And I think you have to really train the rest of your team to be sort of philosophically operating in this way, which again, for a lot of organizations, that's a really big ask. So, it's kind of why we don't work with everybody. And I don't say that to be arrogant by any stretch of the imagination. It's just not every organization is in a place where they're ready to really kind of like commit at that level. But ironically, I think when they do, amazing things happen.
What I find so interesting is how and I love that because I've been in that same circumstance where I'm buying something at a theater because I go to theater a lot, and it's so interesting how they always add that little service fee, and I buy it, but it's like, oh man, there is that, and now that you tell me, it is more on the conscious mind. I'm realizing that is kind of a distaste in it. So I love how you approach that. I'm curious because one of the things that I love to do is go to Columbus Crew, which is a soccer place, and they actually moved the whole stadium from the outskirts of Columbus to the inside. Downtown, it was called Nationwide Arena, and one of the biggest things they did that is because of the energy, the synergy. They had the hockey, they had the baseball team, they had the Clippers, they had also the Columbus Crew. So there's a lot of activity around there. So that prior to the game, they could have dinner, they could have all that stuff, walking distance from this. And it was $1 million, several millions of dollars. I think it was 8 figures or something like that to move it down there. But they noticed the sale ticket price drastically increased, so it paid itself off later on. Now, again, I don't know the owners, but I thought it was very interesting. I analyzed that. I thought, oh, this is unique of how they did that, why they did it, and the logic behind it. I want to kind of talk a little bit about, Peter, the energy, right? When someone comes to the environment, and I look at this in today's world where people are online, you can still have the same community kind of focus. I'm noticing large brands are doing this very well, leveraging social media, leveraging these kind of things. But when you're coming into these arenas and you got to set the pace, you got to set the environment, you got to set that energy so they just feel it, they get excited, they get pumped up because obviously you want to amp everything up. I'm curious, what do you guys do to make sure that energy's there, right? That synergy, that excitement, maybe some little free activities, maybe some stuff for the kids, maybe some free giveaways, maybe some things to keep things going. Maybe even after the game, when they win, do they get like some sort of extra discount to say, hey, what's the likeliness, like lifetime value? Are they going to come back to this? What are certain things that you're doing to help them like constantly stay more involved at a subconscious level that they may or may not be aware of?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there's a lot of things you can do. And I think different organizations kind of take different tacks on this. So I don't know that I believe there's a right or wrong, but I think there's a way that sort of we approach it that we think is sort of the right way. And that is that if you come in and think that they're just coming for the game, right? And that sort of everything leading up to it and everything after it is kind of like, that's not really your responsibility. That's probably the first mistake that we see, some organizations make. Because, if you look at the ritual around sports, right, there's the whole idea of like, you're going and you got this thing you're going to wear. Do you know what I mean? And again, this is what we love about sports, right? And we're just translating it to other sectors, but it's kind of like, it's deeply irrational to see like a 40-year-old man who goes like shirtless in front of 80,000 people wearing shoulder pads, even though he probably never played football, that have spikes on it and like a skeleton mask. Do you know what I mean? Or I'll use a Cleveland one for you, right? Like a, whatever, 60-year-old man who takes his grandkids to a football game and he wears a hound dog mask and, a jersey that's probably like 2 sizes too small for him, but he doesn't care, right? Because that's the jersey he's been wearing for like 25 years or so. Part of this is, I think you have to start by understanding how much identity is wrapped up in the experience for people. Right? They're not just going for this one moment. The one moment's very important, don't get me wrong, But the lead up to all of this and what they expect and how they want to behave and how they want to consume when they are there has a lot to do with who they are as a human being and how they reinforce that, right, to the rest of their family or to the people who matter to them. And, I'll never forget, I'll tell you this story really quick because it really kind of humbled me, to just be totally honest with you. We were doing some season ticket holder interviews once. And we got set up with this woman, and she came in by herself. And so we were just talking. She was a very, very nice woman. I would put her in her like late 40s, early 50s. Not particularly wealthy. When we were just sort of talking about why did she come to games and this, that, and the other thing, and she stopped dead and she looked straight at me and she said, "'Cause this is my family." And I was kind of like, "Oh, bless your heart," right? Like, that's so nice that that you use that terminology. So I was like, "Oh, well, that's," and I totally missed what she was saying. And what she really meant is, this is in fact my family. And then she started to tell me, like, her parents were both gone. She had no brothers and sisters, which means she had like no nieces, no nephews. And so the people around her where she sat, because she only had one seat, and really her frequency rate was like off the chart. She didn't go to every single game, but almost every single game. And what was humbling for me was, well, I do have a family, so I don't think like that because I go do these other things. But for her, going to games meant something entirely different. And it was not about whether she was going to get a discount in the team store or if she got, a free Chick-fil-A sandwich after the game the next day, or like, do you know what I mean? Like, those things, they matter, right? They're kind of like male, female, household income. Like, I'm not saying they have no effect. They do. But what really I was sort of like humbled by was that this woman's world was a large part of this team. And so when you start to think of usage that way, and like, what was she expecting when she was coming to games, right? And what was her sense of anticipation? And what needs in her world were getting met that night when she came to that game? You start to kind of, you start to see something very different. There was another case where, we interviewed a woman. She was not a season ticket holder. She was just an individual game buyer. And she just kind of like randomly got on our list, and we talked to her and was like, "Oh, okay." At that time, I want to say that she had come to a midweek game against the Milwaukee Bucks pre the Greek Freak, when Milwaukee was kind of like a bit of a dog opponent, right? So she came to kind of like a dog opponent on a midweek game, midweek day, and we started asking her like, what was the decision making process, and she said like, "Well, I'll just be really, really honest with you. I've been saving all year long to bring my son to his first ever NBA game. And thank you so much for having variable pricing, because that was the game I could afford." So it had nothing to do with the Milwaukee Bucks. It had nothing to do with a Friday night or a Saturday or any of those things. It had to do with a single mom who had been literally like putting money aside for the better part of a year so that she could finally take her son to an NBA game for the first time. Right. So again, I was very, very humbled by sort of those kind of stories. And then you start working backwards to say like, okay, if those are the kind of things that are happening every night in my building, right, then am I really programming this in the right way? Or am I constantly like, make noise, t-shirt gun, t-shirt gun, t-shirt gun, right? Or do there need to be more ramps in how we actually move people emotionally through a game? And I think that, for me, that has a lot more to do with sort of how the event is produced. And there's lots of ramps that happen when the game is occurring, because a lot of times you're responding to what's happening on the field of play. But there's lots of ramps that can get built into what happens in the pregame, and this whole notion of sense of arrival, right? So when somebody comes like that, and I'll take it out of sports, and I'll use, to me, another really great example. If you have kids and you've ever taken your children to Disneyland for the first time, or Disney World, and you just watch their face when the first time they can kind of see it on the horizon, and they're like, right? That's sense of arrival. And you may not even be going until the next day. And you see how Disney goes about actually, in a very sequenced way, introducing you to sort of the whole experience of being at Disney. And, I asked them this question once. I was like, hey, the whole parking lot tram thing, like, why don't you guys just use buses? Isn't there like a simpler way to do this? And they were like, oh, no, see, this is the first ride. And I was like, what? And they were like, this is the first ride. And I was like, ride, you mean like, wait in line, get on a ride? And they were like, yeah, what we understood is, just think of that. The kids have been in the back seat the whole time. Maybe they drove from wherever to get here. We're in this giant parking lot. We're not even inside of the park yet. And then this tram comes around the corner. And yeah, it's not, the end all be all. But if you've been sitting in the back seat for like 4 hours and you're 9 years old, the tram is like, yes, Disney, we have arrived, right? And then when you get inside of Disney, and if you've never seen this before, it's a bit of a cheat, I guess, and hopefully Disney doesn't mind that I'm saying these things, but I just thought it was so brilliant because when you walk in, they make sure that there's mascots right there early on. Okay. And so when I asked the question, like, oh, don't they get kind of mauled? Like, isn't that, shouldn't you want to like explore and kind of like find mascots? And they were like, well, we do that too. But the reason that we have mascots when you first walk in is so that mom and dad can basically get pictures right away, so that the whole rest of the time they're in the park, they're not like, God, we got to find Goofy because, right? Like, and in the back of their mind, they kind of can't let go because they got to find Belle to get a picture with their daughter or their son and Belle or something like that. So they relieve people of that early on by actually having things like their mascots when you first walk in the door. So, we started doing things like, okay, let's have our mascot taking pictures with people when they first walk through the doors. Let's take our cheerleading teams and our street teams and and let's put them actually at the doors so that when people first come in. And then we started to change our hiring practices where we weren't looking for dancers and cheerleaders who could only dance, but they had basically no interpersonal skills because they were just hardcore, amazing on court or on field of play performers, but not great if they ever got like stuck in front of a fan. And so that really started to alter how we thought about hiring people and training people. And then how do we actually basically arm them with narratives, right? So that they could go out and actually share some of the broader campaign to reinforce that idea that you've arrived. And you didn't get sucked in by buying the campaign and then you got here and it's something different, right? Because it's always been a pet peeve of mine where it's like, hey, come down for 80s night or something like that. And you're like, oh, that'll be fun. And then you get there and you're like, oh, so they're just playing 80s music and that's it, right? I guess there's a lot of that goes on too. So I think Disney to me has always been, sort of the gold standard in terms of like really, kind of understanding or, if you're in Atlanta, I would always tell people, go to the World of Coke. You'll be blown away. You'll be absolutely blown away. This is a beverage company, right? And they literally have an experiential museum and it's a beverage company. So I think, it can be done outside of sports, outside of amusement parks, outside of, all these different things. And I'll just tell you lastly, we work with a lot of airports. And this has been a really like a bit of a phenomenon for airports too, because airports very much act like just, vessels where other people do business and things come and go. And their job is to keep it safe and on time. And, the first airport we ever started working with was Cincinnati International. It's just, an amazing senior team that just wants to see and look at things differently. And, I said to them, if the next time you're on an airplane, just look around as soon as wheels touch ground at what everybody does. And they were like, oh, some people cheer. I was like, no, not everybody does that. But everybody else does one thing. They reach in the pocket in front of them and they pull out their phone and they basically, turn airplane mode off. And then you see them start checking text messages, listening to voicemails, like, whatever they do, but they're all on their phone. And I said, who do you think they're thinking they're getting messages from? And it's whoever's important in their life, right? So people want to be reconnected all the time. And the weird thing about being in an airplane is in some ways you're sort of like disconnected from your world. So I said, if we were to take that a little bit further and watch people when they get off at the gate, right? And they're kind of disorientated and they're trying to find their way around if they haven't been to that airport. And then they get down into sort of like where baggage is and where you get to meet the outside world. And if you've never done it, just stop for a couple minutes and let a big flight sort of like move past you and just watch what happens when people reconnect with whoever it is who's important to them in their life, right? It's an incredibly emotional place to be because you see people, and the same stories I was sharing with you earlier that it hadn't occurred to me that these things were happening at our games, right? That are also happening at an airport. You see somebody and you can tell someone's died and they're hugging and they're sort of crying because you just can tell something bad has happened. And then you see somebody else and it's like a grandma is meeting her grandson for the first time ever, right? You're kind of like witnessing all of this stuff happen. And so we're saying to airports, like, you guys have to capitalize on that, right? Because you're the place that's actually occurring for the first time for those people. And then we kind of equated it to the Olympics for them. And if you're at all familiar with, figure skating and women's singles in particular, there's an area called the kiss and cry. And the kiss and cry is, after that figure skater performs and, in female singles, which is kind of like drives most of the winter games, when she comes off and she skates over and her coach or coaches are there and they wait for their scores to come in, that's called the kiss and cry, that area, right? Because everyone's either crying or just about crying or crying happy because they're elated about their scores, right? But it's this like little window that you get into this deeply emotional space that this athlete is. And you think like that person has worked for 4 years for this 20-second moment where they're waiting for their scores to come down, right? And we're getting to kind of like witness that. Well, that's what's happening at that airport when, arrivals comes in and there's that sort of like brackish water of, moving out of a secure space into an unsecure space and people coming together. So it happens outside of sports. It happens outside of Disney. And I think, if I'm a retailer, if I'm in the hospitality space, these are all very, very real things. And this is why we keep saying like this notion of fandom and kind of like, what we have wrapped up in this is not a sports phenomenon. It's just maybe most visible there in Western society because sports has such a really prominent role culturally, but it also is happening in all these other places. So that's probably a way too long answer to your question, but I think, pragmatically, a lot of this kind of stuff can be brought to bear when you're talking about experience. And if you think about it this way, it will even change how you architecturally imagine spaces, right? If you want a space to be more conducive to this, just in terms of how it's laid out and how people are allowed to come into it and then how they migrate out of it, how long they're allowed to linger there, all those kind of things. Because it's another pet peeve of mine in sports where, let's say you're in a big playoff game, you're the home team, you win, and then like 6 minutes after the final buzzer or whistle or pitch or whatever, there's some ushering staff coming down like, hey, I got to get you out of here. I go, we got to move you out of the building. And it happens all the time. And you're like, oh my God, we spent millions of dollars to get these people to come to feel the way we're feeling right now. And because we don't have this threaded through our entire organization, I got ushers who are like, nope, you got to go. You guys got to talk outside the building. I know it's minus 30 out there. I don't give a, just, you can't be here because we got to start cleaning this building. Right? And it's like, what? It just rationally, if you think about it purely from a business sense, like you have finally accomplished what you were trying to do from a brand experience perspective. Okay. And then you just suck all the air out of the room the same way you did when you added $126 in fees, right? So that's why districts, as you described with Columbus, I think really work. And you're seeing that as a model in sports and frankly beyond sports. Because people want to come down, they want to have an experience, but then they want to linger because they want to talk about it with the people that they came with, or they want to meet other people, and that's where group affiliation happens, right? So we got the identity side of it, and then you've got the group affiliation side, which is wildly important to people. So if you don't let them affiliate, it's like, why are we doing this in the first place? It just doesn't really kind of make any sense. But back to that, how do I scale it? I got to move people through. It's throughput. Like that's all the rational side of it, Christian, that I think business gets way, way too caught up in. And then they lose the power of sort of the human element of this, which is what people really, really want to pay for.
Well, what I find so interesting, and I appreciate you just amazing examples. And I feel like, like you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, it's like this pendulum, right? There's economics, the CFO and the CEO, and what the investors look for. And then there's this human aspect where it's scaling the unscalable. It's those small touch points. It's those small things. And I think Elon Musk did this very brilliantly in Tesla with his, the dog mode, for example. It's that, I didn't even know, that's so cute. How appreciative. Like there's just small minuscule thing that's just so irrelevant to a lot, but it's very relevant to those that have a dog. It's like, or animal of some sort. And so it's just those small things. And like you mentioned as well, I love how you shared with Disney, it's not about, economics. It's about that first ride. It's that first experience. It's that, to check that off and what's interesting is they were able to answer a question or answer that, checkbox, and those parents weren't even noticing that they had to check that off. Right. And so because they understood that data, they understood that like, hey, what can we do to make sure that they don't even have to ask for it? We're already giving it to them. And that's where it's that user experience. I want to ask you, Peter, because I know we're kind of going a little bit longer, and I really appreciate your time. I want to ask, when you start hitting scale, okay, and we see these large companies, they get it, they're fighting for it, they grow, and then like you mentioned, then it's almost like they lean back to the pendulum of economics, and they lean back to the pendulum of, okay, hey, you know what, we are we going to make money? How are we going to make more money? How are we going to scale, et cetera? How do you ensure, right, maybe certain boundaries or systems when you're hitting mass scale and you're hitting market penetration and you got momentum? How to make sure that you don't fall off that bus? Make sure you don't fall off that kind of pathway.
It's an excellent question, and I think it's maybe one that's most difficult for organizations. And my simple answer is leadership, because I think I've had people argue with me like it can't be done, and I said, well, tell that to Apple, right? Like, I don't know, Apple seems to kind of pull it off every single day, year after year, right? Like, so they're my example of like, nah, don't tell me that that's not possible. And I've also had a lot of discussions with people who have said like, my CFO doesn't get it, or my COO, he was the CFO or she was, and their whole thing is about. And I'm like, well, see, this is a you problem now, because you're speaking your language to her and you're expecting her to basically translate. And the leadership component of this is, I think as a leader, you need to have enough self-awareness to actually flip the table and say, okay, this maybe seems like hocus pocus or squishy, KPIs or whatever. But what I can tell you, and why this works with Apple and why this works with Disney, is because when you have people in that emotive space, okay, and they're feeling all the things that we're talking about here for all the various reasons that they are, price sensitivity is almost a non-factor, right? So if you're an Apple person and you really like Apple stuff, and you like it when someone is like, oh, dude, is that the 14 Pro Max? And you're like, yeah, I just got it. You know what I mean? They're like, sweet. How's the camera? Oh, it's sick. Right? Like, Do you really use that camera a lot? Did you really buy it because of the camera? Of course not. You just like Apple. You like the way it makes you feel. It says something about who you are, right? Obviously, they make campaigns about this. Remember the campaign with like the Apple guy and the IBM guy, right? They literally they were demonstrative about this. And the thing is, you don't need that like $1,300 phone, but you buy it anyways. Just like when you go to Disney, you could have probably stopped and fed everybody before you got to the park, right? And you probably could have packed waters, and you probably could have packed some sandwiches, because I think they actually let you bring some food in, but people just don't do that, right? And then when you get, to whatever concession stand because the kids are thirsty, and you look up and you're like, $12 for a water or a soda, or $18 for the souvenir cup. And you look over at your kids and you're like, who wants souvenir cups? Right? And they're like, me. And you think like, oh, for sure, we're bringing these souvenir cups home. They're going to live at our house forever. And they don't come home. Right? So again, I think, leadership is about being able to translate this to whoever sort of the apex predator is in your organizational ecosystem. Whether that is your board or your CEO or your president or whoever that is, to say, look, I want to help you understand this because here's strategically how I'm going to use this as the underpinnings to make this economically not just viable, but valuable for our company. And I think using examples like Apple, Disney, I could keep going, right? Beats is another good one. Like, you think about the price of Beats, and then you actually start, listening to other headphones and speaker manufacturers who've been around for 100 years who make, I think, a much better product, but they don't have the brand, right? And there's not sort of all this cultural sort of attachment to it and all these kind of things. And so there are great examples of that to be able to sort of convey. So like I said, if you're a CMO and you want to live in this kind of like heart brand space, I think that's great. I think it's amazing. But I think we also have to be aware and conscious about the fact that, you determining that you want to live in that space doesn't mean that that's where your CEO or your COO or your CFO actually envision it, or your shareholders for that matter. But if you can kind of translate this for them in a language that they understand and then actually measure it and demonstrate it, I think you get a lot of leash. I think you get a tremendous amount of leash because your numbers basically prove it out. And what I love about folks like that is they don't typically require a lot of proof, right? It's kind of like, oh, okay, good. I see it in the numbers. Like, carry on basically. And I think, again, if you look at Disney right now and the return of basically, their spiritual leader, it's sort of interesting because you read anything about him, he gets this, right? He gets this. And again, I'll stop on this, but what I love about the Disney example is this feeling and everything that we've talked about. They've actually built vernacular around it. And it's vernacular that the consumer has picked up. So it's not even vernacular internally anymore. And basically, it all comes down to one word with Disney all the time. Do you know what the word is?
Dream. What is it?
Magic.
Magic.
Right? So you come in, make a magic moment, make somebody feel magical, right? All those kind of things. Magic is totally irrational. It's wildly irrational. But what people love, the same way they get to a sporting event, and if you're somebody who's putting an event on, like you talked about earlier, and you're sort of thinking about like, how do I kind of, make this experience? I think what I came to realize was in those kind of environments, people are willing to suspend disbelief, right? And that is a really, really powerful thing, because when they're willing to suspend disbelief, they're basically asking you to create an environment for them to be able to operate in for maybe 3 or 4 hours at a, baseball game or something like that, maybe an entire day at a Disney park. Coca-Cola talks about it as like, that magic moment. Basically, they don't key in on the word magic as much, where basically like for $2, you can be having a terrible day, but for 5 minutes, you just crack an ice cold Coke, go, 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 right? And then maybe your crappy day starts all over again, right? But for 5 minutes and $2, you can have that moment, you can have that break. And what's really interesting is if you look at Coke's advertising over the years, they went from just that being singular to like, oh, you can do that with somebody else. So for 5 minutes, you can have that communal moment, right? We're just both clinking 2 Coke bottles, kind of like, yeah, it's just good right now, just you and I, right? These are deeply, deeply human things. That has really nothing to do about a beverage. That's why I said I think there's these wonderful examples out there that, in particular, if you're in the sports industry, to look outside of the industry for inspiration where these things are happening, because they've been developed in much, much more sophisticated ways over time. So yeah, I hope that's helpful.
It is, and that's one of the things, Peter, I really appreciate you just being on here and, taking the forefront, leading this charge, having this conversation and being able to integrate this at a micro level and understanding human behavior at such a subconscious level, because it is so important. And like you mentioned, it does produce incredible results at the end of the day, stickiness of those clients. But one of the biggest things I want for our listeners to understand is how to leverage what Peter was talking about and integrate it at a micro level into your own business, right? Whether you're a B2B, whether you're a D2C, whether you're e-com, whether you're SaaS, whatever it is, say, really step back and say, okay, hey, sometimes we got to stop looking at economics and metrics and say, okay, hey, let's dive into the human psyche, right? And having those questions, having that dialogue. Peter, I really appreciate you being on here, man. And, just the incredible knowledge you just shared a little bit. I know we could go on another 2 hours, but Peter, for those that want to obviously learn a little bit more, you've got a ton of content out there. Maybe want to engage with what you got going on. How do they reach out to you, bud?
Yeah, look, it's they can certainly reach us through the website. It's just seer.world, no .com, really, really easy. And honestly, if they want to reach out directly, I would be flattered. They can just reach me at peter@seer.world. I'm happy to chat and share any materials and learnings that we have. Frankly, if it makes their business grow or helps sort of shape the perspective of how they're going about doing what they're doing.
Awesome, guys. And those links will be in the description, so make sure you stop what you're doing. And Peter, I appreciate you making yourself so available where you put your email down there as well. So I'll make sure I put his email down there, his LinkedIn, his website. And again, he's got a ton of other different podcasts out there, so I'll make sure I link that down there so you guys can get just a different context with it. So again, Peter, I really appreciate you being on. That is my friend, the one and only CEO of Sea World, my friend, Peter Sorckoff. Guys, that is Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. Until next time, be uncommon if you can.